Прошу прощения за то, что я буду говорить по-итальянски, но я думаю, что...
Sorry for making this presentation in Italian.
Il titolo della mia breve...
Well, the title of my short presentation certainly reminds the fundamental work known for all those who study Soviet culture, theme of culture, column 3, which also refers and taps on certain aspects and nuances of chronologies and limitations of such phenomena as modernism in general and Soviet modernism. And it certainly refers to the roots of this very complex phenomenon and also the prospect which were born in the time of Khrushchev's revolution and which was identified with a new idea of architecture which, in my opinion, was relevant to the Soviet trends of the earlier times. When we talk about modernism, we certainly mean when it's always associated, when we talk about the revolution of the 1950s, it's always connected to the political turn initiated by Khrushchev, and such years as 1954 and 55 are the dates definitely very relevant to this process. As a well, I think we need to think and keep in mind this very sharp definitions, and I think that whatever concerns Soviet architecture, we may review and see a lot of different nuances, hues, and shadow zones. And it also refers to the transitional period from one type to another type of the Soviet architecture, how we can identify this major political, cultural, and architectural cycles in the Soviet history. It's quite easy to do if we take a look at that time's magazines and see the official message of the time passed on from the authorities to the architectural community. And also we should look at the undercurrent movements which inspired the architects, and I think that for many reasons it might be quite interesting. Later we shall outline some of these reasons to trace these deeply rooted causes which we may see in the very core of social realism art starting from the late 1930s. I can't go into further details simply to due time limitations, but many traditionally interpret social realism as a very compact phenomenon, put on a very exact timeline, and definitely manifested by such well-known venues as the Palace of Soviets or Zheltovsky's architecture. But I think still it's much more complicated, a complex opinion, and cannot be seen as expression of. Now it's working. So, as I said, that was not the expression of the will coming down from power or group at the top of the power, although the configuration of Stalin's regime assumes certain interpretation. Well, socialism is a multifaceted phenomenon. There are many faces of it for many witnesses and many historians. Even Stalin himself had many faces. For example, I recall an interview given by Lazar Moisevich Kaganovich, who in his late years was given an interview and answering the question about who was Stalin. He has confronted, what Stalin are you asking about? I know at least 5 Stalins. Stalin before revolution, Stalin of revolution time, Stalin from 20s, well, pre-war time and post-war period of time. Same is quite applicable when we talk about architecture. Socialism, besides the outlook which it had, where total just appearance, had many other expressions, very complex social expression, but it was also a social project, and that's important to keep in mind. Social realism, in my opinion, does not emerge from the winning of the fun and the competition for the palace of Soviets, but it started from implementing a policy rejection, egalitarianism, and starts focusing on some project of architectural development, where architecture has to reflect the social structure of social pyramid, social. Okay, Stalinism, or the post-war period of time, and probably from the time before the war, is associated with monumental structures, most solid and its visible, appearance. But if we refer to the documents, even to the archives, not only referring to architecture, but also to social dialectics, will see a much more complicated picture, and behind the social picture, well, we see that socialism allowed, well, some kind of a very advanced and progressive approaches to research, and in particular that was construction of building using prefabricated materials, and the fact that social model of Soviet architecture could not keep on the power of such drastic demographic growth, well, and concerning project activities and exclusive measures in this area. And this piece of building, which is familiar to you all, of course, it's one of the buildings was built between 1940 and 41 using prefabricated blocks. So that was one of the first approaches to this type of building using such materials, and also one of the most interesting examples in the history of Soviet architecture, but also a very important evidence of architectural development in the 20th century.
And now I would like to focus on one other aspect, which is about low-story buildings in the United States. I'm not gonna go into details, it's very famous, and I wanted to focus on the war and the atmosphere, as well as transfer of technologies and cultures. This enable us to get to know the prefabricated blocks and using those blocks in construction. They are discussing this in architectural academies in 1943, 1944, and there are lots of documents available for study. And so now there's an opportunity to criticize those trends from Burov's point of view, and it's related to monumentalism and monumentalist architecture that was developed out of the war. Many people require changing their views, including input of these American models. It's also part of social realism. This is the war time period. So this criticism that followed the war and in the years followed by is something that we can see in the magazine Architecture and Construction, especially if you take a look at the first editions of this magazine. So the first stages of reconstruction before the Cold War started. So this low-story buildings, these low-story housing were constructed using those semi-fabricated blocks, and they were going to build these individual houses, and it was aligned with Stalin's program, both for the construction of public buildings and private construction. And later on, we can see a trend towards the split between those two countries, and it's related to the Cold War. 1946, 1947, the official image is going back to monumentalism, and so achieves connotations that we know so well, like high rises, skyscrapers. And if you take a look at the legislation and acts that were adopted at that time, we can see that there were continuous research studies implemented by Architectural Academy in order to study the system of construction based on prefabricated blocks. So here you can see some examples of those studies that were carried out at that time when Stalin was still alive. And it's all related to prefabricated blocks that were used in construction. And of course, it's also, we can see the symmetry and the technological aspects required certain restriction to restrict some certain monumentality of Stalinism. So these are images from 1954-55, and here we can see that these images help us to imagine Burov's buildings in the context. And at the same time, they started experimental programs. As far as I know, this building is located in Horoshovskoye Chaussee. It's not far from Oktyabrskoye Pole. And of course, again, there were limited opportunities at that time, but still we can see a certain breakthrough. So this is the official image. The image that was translated in the West, the image that was exported all over the world, because the Soviet Union was to be demonstrated as the center of the world. But the reality was completely different. So why did they have these turns? Why it didn't turn into a fundamental, big fundamental program like Khrushchev's program? So if we take a look at the archives and the materials related to the social sphere of Soviet society's transformation, we can see a lot of dissatisfaction. And of course, the party authorities noticed that they were filtering that dissatisfaction, and it's a big question for historians. Social realism in post-Stalin time period was part of post-Stalin apparatus because it had a clear vision and so they no longer dreamt of the house for all. It was no longer a priority. And of course, you should understand the climate, the international atmosphere. There were talks about the shadows of the Third World War, so the priority was with investments into military sector and the invention of the nuclear bomb. So this system, these priorities imposed certain restrictions and limitations, and they're worth studying because they make a big impact on the situation. When Stalin died, the first stage of the nuclear program was finished, and that's when the nuclear bomb was tried and Gulag system of camps collapsed. So this was the major part of fundamental, monumental construction. And so then Khrushchev came on stage and began to have a turn. Here we can see the letter by Gradov, a researcher that was working at the Architectural Academy, and he wrote a letter to Khrushchev in 1954, and he was speaking about something that Khrushchev was telling everyone himself. So this step was made outside from the community that lived during Stalin's time. So this turn that I'm speaking about had to include different technical models that were illustrated here, but they put those models into a new context because the society had to strive towards well-being. So the connotations of the Soviet society changed because this was a turn towards building communism as the society of general well-being. And the nuclear project that used to be a barrier that hindered other sectoral development became the point of power, the element of power. So Khrushchev sent many people into housing construction, and they were those people that worked there for a long time that could show that you could build an island of efficiency. So that's why they consolidated their efforts to improve their construction programs. I just wanted to show different nuances related to late Stalinism and social realism and revolution that Khrushchev did. So the debates that took place in the 50s were obvious because before Khrushchev, design elements were very active and still relevant in Soviet designers' works. For example, Leonid Pavlov. They moved through many different phases of Soviet history because this turn towards modernism involved the participants that lived through avant-garde and modernism, and it was the deep understanding that they had, of course, helped them to do it. Then the cultural criticism, a new vision of private life, the centralized character of this new vision of modernity. And I would like also to emphasize certain specific elements peculiar to that time. They never rejected socialism, because this was the background that everybody referred to, and I could find different images like this, and they are related to the city ensemble. This was one of the main ideas of socialism, that gave a united vision, the whole vision from a single building up to the whole system. So this is a big legacy of Soviet culture. Then Khrushchev liberalization opened new opportunities for culture, because it involved collaboration with international culture. And I would like to thank Professor Bronovitska for this picture, because this was a translation of the text that became very important for the architects. So here you can see the translation that was published in 1956. Then later on there were attempts to move towards a rational vision of architecture through research and synthesis of architecture and engineering. And at the same time, the synthesis of arts remained a basic element. So here you can see some examples of how the new ideas circulated. And they were not necessarily one vector directed or velocity. They were moving in different directions. So this is a Polish magazine, and in Poland they had lots of excellent magazines. And it's not only in Poland, but in many other countries that can give very interesting discoveries that can't be found anywhere in the world. For example, this is the some buildings and we can see the borrowing of ideas, the Stadium Druzhba. This is the page from the same time period. When we see this influence, it's so obvious. We can see how this building was created. So we can see all the inventions and Piero Luigi Nervi's ideas. Nervi was developing very special architecture. Very skillful works, and many Soviet architects borrowed his ideas, digested them, and use it for the industrial approach. So this was the time period when the Soviet avant-garde was rediscovered. So we can see this project for the Palace of Soviets, and I think it was Ivan Leonidov and Konstantin Melnikov's designs. So this happens in late 50s and early 60s, when avant-garde was digested as legacy, and so we come towards dialogue and a return to avant-garde. And of course, it was very important to get back to innovations, to revive some revolutionary ideas. So it's very interesting to take a closer look at these connections. You know Osterman, and you know all these projects. Ginsburg also participated in this process. Then Vladimirov's General House, and they get back to the 30s, the trends that existed in the 30s, and similar projects were in the Czech Republic, in Czechoslovakia. So I think I managed to show you different elements in that process. So original approaches together with original views, and modernism is in constant dialogue with international style, and it has its own elements related to mass production, mass housing, very complicated work related to rethinking history. So unlike the Western world, this is a very unique work. So Pavlov's career and Pavlov's works show all those different stages in the Soviet history. And so the mature works of Pavlov show the return to avant-garde. So he's going back there, and we can see the roots of his works in social realism, and it can be then found in postmodernist construction. This is the fruit of the dialogue with the West, and also the fruit of unique and singular topics relevant for Soviet architecture. And finally, I would like to say that many Western specialists work on these issues, but the narrative about contemporary art does not include those issues. So that's why it's a very important issue to study, because Soviet modernism, socialist modernism, expresses many innovations. They might be similar to the Western world, but at the same time they're very special. So the geography is huge. So and of course it has a lot. A big part of the 20th century architecture. So I would like to finish with the quotation of historian Lichko, and it was published in Architectural Review, and he was thinking about the overview of the architecture. So he said that there might be two types of architecture: architecture of bureaucracy and architecture of genius. And it's very interesting to see the definition that he gives to those terms. And it's related to the experience that was here in the Soviet Union and other socialist countries. So I think it's an extremely interesting material, so we should refer to it as much as possible for preservation, in particular, to preserve this heritage. So thank you for your attention, and I hope you understood what I meant to tell you. Did you have the translation?
Спасибо, Alessandro. У меня есть такой вопрос или замечание.
Thank you very much, Alessandro. I have this question related to the term socialist realism. It was introduced in 1934, and it was related to literature. Then later on, it was used in many other areas of art, but it was never formulated for stylistics. So whenever we use the term Stalin's empire style, because empire style is a very clear style, Stalin's architecture did never have its own style. We had a beautiful album published earlier on about the masterpieces of Soviet architecture. For example, Pisminy works, constructivist buildings, some retro buildings by Zholtovsky, and many others. So socialist realism was never a formula that you could follow. So I think that the things that were included into the positive list were connected to the loyalty of the architect. It was often said that, yes, socialist realism should include American technology and constructivism, but when Vesnin at the Architects' Congress began to give unapproved texts, then constructivism became Trotskyist ideology, so the ideology which was related to Trotsky. So yes, I agree with you on the one hand. I absolutely agree with you. But I would say that socialist realism was an open system, but practically speaking, it was very specific for architects. For example, when the Soviet people exported socialist realism during post-war period, it looked like a closed neighborhood. But it was a very clear idea, this closed district and ensemble type of construction. So that's why we speak about the synthesis of arts. Then, thirdly, it's true, there were endless debates and arguments, but in the 30s there appeared the articles and that showed this is what socialist realism is. Let's take a look at the metro. And what is metro? Metro is this melting pot of different trends, representation of various things. So socialist realism was a very open system. And I wanted to highlight that the architecture of social realism had a certain elements from theoretical point of view, but it's just we also refer to the socialist system against leveling. Then there were special buildings for leaders, then expressiveness, something that the architects were thinking about. Every building had to have its own character, and it had to fit within that model of hierarchy. This was relevant for socialist realism. What about narrative character? I agree with what you say. Some time ago, Boris Khmelnytsky published a book, Zodchi Stalin, Architect Stalin. So he studied the personality of Stalin in the development of this style and the genealogy of that time and that architecture. And there is a document that shows very interesting information. So it's very interesting to study the role of Khrushchev and turn towards housing building. Then they show very long genealogy, beginning with his adolescence at the machine building plant in Ukraine, when he saw this first conveyor belts then some episodes when they collaborated with Kaganovich and they launched some pilot projects, and they were all connected with housing construction. And he basically presents this idea as if he was overwhelmed with it since the childhood. Then he explains their relationships with Stalin, and he used Stalin's weaknesses as arguments to convince Stalin so that he could launch his work earlier. So it sounds very convincing to me. You might not trust it. You might not trust Khrushchev, who is explaining all those things. So what do you think about it? Well, Khrushchev visited construction sites in the 30s. He participated in that work. After the war, he was the secretary of the regional committee. So this was the early 50s. He also participated in the reconstruction of Kiev. So in 1951, he worked at SKB. This was a structure established by Stalin after he signed the documents. And this was the organization that prepared all the research and developed all the reforms for the construction sector. So Khrushchev was a key figure at that time, and he himself participated in that work. So, of course, Khrushchev adapted his revolution to new strategies. So he was he absorbed those ideas of industrialization much deeper than Stalin. I think that highlighting this turn means that we have to interpret it. We have to interpret the strategies themselves, the strategies of power, because they have to emphasize that big turn in society, that revolution. So you can't really explain. Unfortunately, we don't have time to make comments, but I studied the documents of Khrushchev's address when he speaks about the importance of saving in construction, and it was in 1935. So thank you very much.